Welcome to the Optum Pharmacy Insights podcast. In this forum, we'll discuss the latest and most impactful events in pharmacy benefit management. This episode will focus on the most revolutionary and expensive drugs in history, gene therapies. Today, I'm joined by Nick Cashman, specialty clinical consultant for Optum Rx, as well as Arash Sadeghi, pipeline and drug surveillance at Optum Rx. Before we jump into the subject matter today, can each of you touch upon your backgrounds and areas of responsibility at Optum Rx? Nick, let's begin with you.
Sure. Hey, Scott. Appreciate being on the podcast with you. I'm a pharmacist by trade, got my MBA as well, and started about 5 years ago in specialty pharmacy on the specialty pharmacy side. Did some bench work for a little while and then moved into a B2B role where I was interfacing with manufacturers, payers, health plans, PBMs, the whole gambit. Came on to Optum on the specialty strategy team earlier this year in 2023 and support different specialty strategy initiatives for high impact clients across the board and also some of the work that we're doing internally to drive success and thought leadership in the space. Happy to be here.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Arash, would be interested to hear a little bit about your background and what specifically someone on the pipeline and drug surveillance team at Optum Rx kind of does all day.
Yeah, so thanks for having me here, Scott. So my name's Arash. I've been with Optum Rx for 11 years. I'm a clinical pharmacist. I joined Optum Rx straight out of pharmacy school, so I haven't strayed very far. The entire time I've been here at Optum Rx, I've been in clinical services. The first half of my career here was actually doing drug reviews and basically national P&T support. So reviewing new drugs for formulary consideration and developing utilization management criteria. And then in the last 5 years, a little over 5 years, I've been on our pipeline and drug surveillance team. And basically my role here, I like to say, is serving as kind of the eyes and ears for the organization for what's coming. So my focus is really the brand pipeline, evaluating what new drugs are going to be coming, what products we think could be blockbuster drugs, and it's really the whole gambit. It can be traditional drugs, specialty drugs, and of course, a huge growing area has been gene therapy. So that's, been a huge area of focus for me as well.
Great. Well, gentlemen, why don't we jump right in? Arash, I really want to begin with you. Let's start with the science behind these therapies. What are gene therapies and how do they differ from other drug classes on the market today?
Yeah, so I thought it would be helpful to start with an overview of how your typical drug works. So the typical drug, and this includes small molecules and even more complex biologic products, they basically work by interacting or binding to specific targets in your body. And those targets can range from receptors in your cells to proteins or other molecular targets. And this is an oversimplification, but by interacting with these targets that are thought to be related to a disease, drugs can provide symptom relief or alter disease-causing processes in the body. What standard drugs don't do is they don't alter the patient's actual genetic code. So in the case of inherited diseases or genetic conditions, your standard drug isn't going to be treating the underlying cause of the disease. The other key point with a traditional drug is that they aren't fundamentally changing a patient's genetic code, so the benefits are typically temporary. So your typical drug has to be used continuously or even for a patient's entire life when it's being used to treat a chronic condition. Gene therapy, and sometimes these are referred to as genetically modified cellular therapies, are treatments that directly modify a patient's genes or genetic code in order to treat or cure their disease. So gene therapies are usually evaluated in conditions where there is a very high unmet need and where we don't really have any other treatments currently available because your standard treatment can't treat the underlying genetic defect. And there's really two major categories of gene therapies that have been FDA approved so far. So the first are chimeric antigen receptor or CAR T-cell therapies. These are used to treat certain types of cancers. And the way they work is by modifying a patient's immune system by genetically engineering their T cells, which are immune cells, so that they can produce a special receptor that targets cancer cells. And when the modified T cells interact with these cancer cells, they activate an immune response, which can lead to the destruction of a patient's cancer cells. So that's kind of one big bucket of gene therapy. The other second category, which I think most people think of when they think of gene therapies, are the non-oncology gene therapies that are used to treat diseases caused by genetic defects. So genetic defects can lead to a lack of production or a mutated version of important proteins in the body. And the way your traditional gene therapy works is usually by gene addition. So basically, it provides a patient a functional copy of a gene so that they can produce their own proteins or enzymes. And there are a lot of different techniques for this, but the most common is using some type of viral vector or carrier to deliver the gene to a patient's cells. So a great example of this difference between your more standard type of drug treatment versus gene therapy is how we treat hemophilia B. So hemophilia B is a rare genetic bleeding disorder. It's caused by a deficiency of clotting factor 9, which is a clotting protein. The standard of care historically has been factor replacement therapy, which is basically giving patients a synthetic form of clotting factor to replace their missing or deficient factor. And these patients typically will have to be on chronic, lifelong factor replacement to prevent bleeding episodes. But last year, the FDA approved the first gene therapy for hemophilia B, Hemgenix. And this works by introducing a functional copy of the factor 9 gene into the patient's cells so that they can produce their own clotting factor. And this is administered as a one-time dose, and the goal is to basically eliminate or significantly reduce the need for patients to be on chronic factor replacement therapy. And I think that's the key point here, that gene therapies are intended to be used as a one-time dose. And the benefit is hopefully going to be sustained. So the hope is that you're going to see long-lasting or even permanent benefits, but that's also the great unknown with these treatments, because we just don't have enough long-term data to know how long these treatments really provide benefit to patients.
Arash, the first gene therapy was approved in 2017. From your perspective, how has the market evolved since then?
So I think a couple things really have changed from where we were in 2017 to where we are now. So first, most gene therapies that were initially approved in those first few years were CAR T-cell therapies for cancer. So if you look at 2017 to 2021, we had 5 CAR T-cell therapies approved compared to just 2 kind of true gene therapies for genetic diseases. And those 2 were Luxturna, which was approved in 2017 for a very rare genetic eye disease. And then in 2019, we got Zolgensma, which was approved for spinal muscular atrophy, which is a rare neuromuscular disease. Now, CAR T-cell therapies have a lot of similarities with other gene therapies, but they're substantially less expensive. So they cost about $400,000 to $500,000 for a single treatment, which in a vacuum is very, very, very expensive, but it's still a fraction of the cost for a gene therapy for a rare disease. Now, over the last couple of years, and really over the last 12 months, that balance has shifted. So in 2022, last year, we saw the beginning of what we anticipate being a wave of gene therapy approvals for rare disease. So we had 3 approvals in late 2022, and then we saw 3 more gene therapies approved for rare diseases this year already. So we went from 2 of these treatments, true gene therapies from 2017 to 2021, to having 8 of those. And really that's, over the last 12 months that change. And just by comparison, we've only had 1 additional CAR T-cell therapy for cancer that's been approved in the last 2 years. The other evolution, I would say, has been around cost. So, I mentioned CAR T-cell therapies are less expensive relative to your more true gene therapies, but even among the non-oncology gene therapies, there's been a real shift in terms of costs. So, when Luxturna was approved, that was $850,000 for a single treatment course. We had Zolgensma that was approved in 2019, and that was $2.1 million. And at the time, that was the most expensive drug ever approved. But if you looked at today, the gene therapies that have been approved, they all hover around about $3 million. And even Hemgenix is $3.5 million, which is currently the most expensive product. So there's been this real increase in price for these products that have probably exceeded even what most of us thought was going to happen for these products. We all anticipated they'd be expensive, but I think even relative to our expectations, they ended up being even more expensive, at least the most recent products.
And it's funny too, Arash, is just hearing your points, I agree with all of them, and thinking out loud, Luxturna, when Luxturna was approved, it really represented an expansion of the applicability of gene therapies. I mean, no longer just focusing on the treatment of cancer. In my mind, a major turning point. I mean, FDA started to prioritize different frameworks, establishing frameworks, policies, guidance documents for drug development. That was a critical turning point and kind of put us on the path to today and into the future as well.
Nick, I'd like to stay with you for this next question and really kind of pick at a theme that Arash just mentioned, and that's the cost of these therapies. You and I spend a lot of time in the marketplace, and plan sponsors are clearly concerned about what type of impact they can see with these therapies. Do we need to think differently about how we pay for gene therapies, at least in the context of how we pay for traditional drug classes today?
Absolutely, and I think I think the logic starts even further upstream than the actual payment. I mean, plan sponsors have to start thinking about how they adjust their business planning practices related to drug spend, client-specific risk modeling to inform, analyze, and predict potential gene therapy exposure is something that everybody needs to be doing now. The implications are too high, financial, and from an outcomes perspective too. We really need to have a clear sense on this. And to touch on the point about payment, we've seen the emergence of outcomes-based agreements, warranty-type agreements with manufacturers. That represents an innovative approach in my mind, and certainly promotes positive outcomes for the members and the payer to some degree, but it doesn't really adequately shield the plan sponsor from all of the financial risk with these outcomes-based agreements. The other piece that represents a risk is employee turnover, in my mind. The plan sponsor may pay the one-time, catastrophic cost for a gene therapy and expect some return on that upfront investment with the improvement to the member's quality of life and maybe offset of some ongoing chronic therapy costs. But if the employee leaves that plan sponsor for a different company, different opportunity, that plan sponsor is still left, they footed the bill while another entity reaps the financial benefit going forward. So you kind of think about, how do we mitigate some of those risks I just touched on? Ideally, you're able to spread the risk, supplant it with a predictable monthly cost, and also, importantly, link the price that you pay to therapeutic outcomes. And we've got the mechanism to do that through outcomes-based agreements, contracts with manufacturers. One unknown I will touch on with those outcomes-based agreements is, in my mind, we're still figuring out how we're going to reliably collect data to inform those outcomes-based agreements. And unfortunately, I don't have time to get into the weeds on it, but I do want to call that out as an important piece. To touch on some of the spreading the risk and supplanting it with monthly predictable costs options to mitigate, we're seeing risk protection products entering the market, and those do a much more effective job of shielding the plan sponsor from the unforeseen and potentially catastrophic claim for a gene therapy.
Nick, do you have a sense of the likelihood a plan sponsor, would incur a claim for a gene therapy in any given year?
Yeah, we've Optum's done some work to kind of model this out and done some probability analysis. Certainly depends on the size of the plan sponsor, right? But as with some of the points that Arash touched on to begin, we're going to continue to see these things come to market. And depending on the size, for example, 10,000 member group, your probability of at least one gene therapy claim in 2025 could be 7%. And by 2029, with expanded patient populations, it might be as high as 33%. I mean, you go up to, if you're a really large group, 250,000 lives, say, you might be at 84% in 2025 from a probability perspective. And then by 2029, 100% is what our model showed. So, I mean, these risk protection products are really critical to consider. And some of the simulations we did with risk assessments, we looked at a 50,000 life group, and it demonstrated significant cost avoidance after premiums, after deductible payments, significant cost avoidance related to gene therapy through risk protection.
Those probabilities you just quoted in kind of in the near term are certainly numbers that are staggering, I'm sure, for plan sponsors that are listening to this. What advice would you have for a plan sponsor concerned about paying for gene therapies?
Yeah, I think plan sponsors should be concerned. I mean, this is a big consideration in the marketplace now. I kind of, as I think about this, there's kind of three hallmark points I would make. First is address it now. Lean on your PBM, on your consultant partners to educate you on the risks and the strategies that you have in your toolbox to help mitigate some of this. The second one, it would be to understand risk protection policies. If you're hearing these things for the first time today, I challenge you that you've got some homework. Read up on these, understand, ensure that the policies you're considering for your plan are comprehensive in terms of the coverage criteria, and make sure that you've got seamless utilization management processes to prevent avoidable disruption to members and providers. Because most risk protection products will define their own coverage criteria and utilization management processes in the policy that the plan must agree to use. So you really got to ensure that alignment of those criteria and those processes are aligned with what you have implemented for your plan. It's critical. It represents a major contingency in determining if that product is right for you. And one other comment I'll make on that point is, it's common that you see pre-exclusion criteria in these risk protection policies with varying degrees of scope. It is imperative to understand these criteria and the implications that they have on member-specific coverage. So really do your homework on this and understand it. Final point is to temper your expectations. It's easy to categorize these gene therapies incorrectly as long-term cures for the conditions they treat. Probably better to view that as the exception to the rule. Depending on the product, durability of response is a major, can represent a major contingency when interpreting the potential clinical and economic value of a gene therapy.
Arash, I'd like to conclude our discussion today with a question for you. As you mentioned in our opening, you're the guy with the crystal ball. Let's take a look ahead. What does the pipeline look like for gene therapies?
Yeah, so I think just kind of looking at the immediate term, and I think what's going to generate a lot of attention and buzz is in December. So we have two fairly highly anticipated FDA approval decisions for gene therapies for sickle cell disease. So we have Bluebird Bio's levodopa-glogene autotemcel or lovo-cel, and then Vertex's exagamglogene autotemcel or exa-cel. So I think this is notable because sickle cell is the largest disease state that will actually have a gene therapy available. So sickle cell disease affects over 100,000 people in the US, which is still a rare disease, but if you compare it to other diseases that have gene therapies, it's much more common than your typical gene therapy. I will say that number is a little bit misleading, that 100,000, because only a small percentage of patients with the disease will be eligible for treatment because you have to meet certain criteria in terms of severity of disease, age, and other things. So it's probably around 10 to 15% of that overall population, but it's still a large population relative to other gene therapies that have come to market where they may be treating less than 100 people. The other, I think, interesting aspect of these decisions is exa-cel. One of the products is potentially the first gene therapy utilizing CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing. So gene editing is different from your traditional type of gene therapy in that, and as the name implies, it involves modifying a patient's existing genes within their genome, whereas your typical gene therapy is doing gene addition, where you're basically adding a functional gene to a patient's genome. So when you compare gene addition versus gene editing, both have potential advantages and disadvantages, but we do have more history with gene addition. So there's obviously been several that have been approved using that technique. So it's more of a known entity in terms of the efficacy and or maybe even more importantly, the safety. So CRISPR-Cas9 is newer. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that review goes from the FDA. And I think in some ways may set the precedent for how future reviews go for other therapies that are utilizing that CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing type of technology. If you look out further in kind of more big picture, potentially there are 10 to 15 more gene therapies that could be approved between 2024 to 2025. So I mentioned earlier, we have 8 that have been approved so far. That could potentially double or even more so in the next couple of years. So this is just going to be a growing area of the pipeline. And I think people need to be really aware of that fact that this, the flurry of approvals that we've had recently, it's not a blip. This is going to become a continuous stream of products that are going to be approved. And I think, Nick alluded to this earlier. Individually, I don't think any of these products are going to have a significant impact or on an individual basis carry a huge risk, but it's really the aggregate. When you really start to see like 10, 15, and as they start to grow even more, that's when you start to see the potential risk that a plan may actually incur a claim for these patients. I think what's also interesting is that there's going to be some competition in this area. So right now, the gene therapies that are available, they're basically one-offs. Basically you have one gene therapy that treats one disease. But there are some conditions like sickle cell disease, other ones include beta thalassemia, hemophilia, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where we actually are going to start to see competition potentially. So I think that's always good to have multiple different options. From a clinical perspective, it gives us an opportunity to evaluate, which product may have better efficacy or safety. But also the hope would be that maybe that brings down the net cost for these products if you actually do have some competition for these disease states, because they are one-off treatments. You basically get one or the other. And then I think just looking beyond 2025 and kind of looking farther ahead, it's important to realize that gene therapies are also being studied outside of genetic diseases, outside of rare conditions. So there is development for more common conditions. A great example of that is retinal diseases, in particular wet age-related macular degeneration or wet AMD. That's one of the leading causes of vision loss in the elderly, and there are multiple gene therapies that are in development for that disease state. So I think the risk that is currently present is only going to grow because right now it's really rare disease, but that could grow into even more chronic conditions. And while that obviously provides a great opportunity from a patient perspective, these treatments would be one-time treatments. It's also going to increase the challenge to payers in terms of how do we cover these products once they expand out beyond just rare disease.
Nick and Arash, I really appreciate the both of you joining our podcast today to really talk about this exciting topic. Thanks for listening to the Pharmacy Insights podcast. I'm your host, Scott Draeger. Tune in again for more discussions as we examine the most important issues in pharmacy care services.